All right, welcome everybody. I'm Rabbi Micah Streifer. I'm the director of Laasok, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this penultimate session of our Social Justice in Our Texts series. Today, we'll be studying with Rabbi Sylvia Rothschild on a topic that's both timely and challenging, the right to live and the right to die. I'd like to first acknowledge the organizations and congregations that are sponsors and promoters of this series. I'm just going to read them all. They are AMMUD, the Jews of Color Torah Academy, the Central Conference of American Rabbis and CCAR Press, Central Synagogue, Congregation B'nai Israel in Little Rock, Arkansas, Congregation Shaarey Zedek in East Lansing, Michigan, Congregation Shir Chadash of the Hudson Valley, Keshet, Kirva Institute, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the Union for Reform Judaism, Temple B'nai Or in Morristown, New Jersey, Temple Judea in Coral Gables, Florida, Temple Shalom in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, Zedek Box, and Women of Reform Judaism, all of that in addition to Laasok, of course. We're grateful to all of our partners for making this important series happen over the course of the year, and we do have one more session as part of this series coming up next month. I also want to thank all of you for being here and all those who donated to make this series possible. If you are interested in making a contribution toward the social justice in our text series, I will drop a link into the chat in a couple of minutes where you can do that. So let me now read the bio for our speaker, and then I'll turn things over to her to lead us in discussion. Rabbi Sylvia Rothschild was born in Bradford, Yorkshire. Bradford is which is home of the third oldest Reformed synagogue in the UK.
Yeah.
She studied psychology and worked as a psychiatric social worker and as a counselor, and then was ordained a rabbi in 1982 at Leo Baeck College in London. She was the 8th woman rabbi in Europe. She served for 14 years at Bromley Synagogue and 12 years at Wimbledon Synagogue, and for the past 9 years has been the visiting rabbi of Lev Chadash in Milan, Italy. She is also the spiritual care lead at Heart of Kent Hospice in Aylesford, where she works to support terminally ill patients and their carers in their spiritual distress and in finding meaning in their lives. Rabbi Rothschild writes contemporary Jewish liturgy, especially for women's life cycle contexts. She is married, has 3 grown children, and a very friendly dog. That was my favorite part of the bio. Let me invite you to join me in the blessing for study. This will be a moment where, if you'd like, we can all unmute and we'll say these words together. We can hear one another blessing this act of study of Torah, and then we'll turn things over to Rabbi Rothschild to lead us. Please join me. Baruch atah Adonai,
Baruch atah Adonai,
Eloheinu melech
Melech
asher
haolam,
kitshanu
Kiddushanu
b'mitzvotav,
b'mitzvotav,
v'tzivanu litzot b'divrei
Laasok
Torah.
b'divrei Torah.
Blessed is the Eternal, whose mitzvot, whose commandments bring holiness to our lives, and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves in words of Torah. Please remute yourselves, everyone, and I'll turn things now over to Rabbi Sylvia Rothschild.
Hello, well, it's lovely to be here. I have to say the very friendly dog is lying at my feet, but if he hears a squirrel, you might hear him bark. So I'll apologize for that in advance, but I didn't really want to leave him howling in another room, and he would have howled in another room. So it's lovely to be here. I'm really glad to hear that you're going to go and continue this conversation after this, because this is such an enormous topic and such a sensitive topic that it's very difficult to hold. It's very difficult to be part of it. And I think what I'm hoping to do, famously people say rabbis write sermons to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. I kind of want to have a little bit of that going on here, that actually to think, rather than kind of have our set opinion at the beginning and stay with it, but to really struggle with some of the issues, because I think this is a really huge piece for contemporary Jewish thought, really. I'm going to begin with a confession. I called this Right to Live, Right to Die when Micah asked me for a topic, but I already knew. I mean, there is no universally acknowledged right to die. The right to live is framed in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It is the foundational right from which all kinds of other rights come. The right to health, the right to education, the right to safety, and so on. So that one cannot be taken away. And in fact, many assisted dying laws that exist are legally in violation of the Declaration of Human Rights, because there is, as I say, no actual right to die. And in fact, assisted dying is often framed as if it is a right, as if it's a human rights issue, but it's really a social issue. It's a matter of people's own ideas. It's a matter of people's own autonomy, and it can never be considered in isolation from the society in which people live. So it isn't really, I'm not going to go, there is a lot written about it legally. I don't want to go into those areas. But I do want you to think really about the combination of a person's wants and needs and benefits or disbenefits, and a society's wants, needs and benefits or disbenefits. Judaism, as you know, doesn't speak in a language of rights. It speaks in a language of obligation, and it speaks in a language of duty, and it speaks in a language of justice, and it speaks in the language of sacredness, that all human rights is sacred. So if you're looking, and I have been on many shiurim where people are looking for kind of like the Jewish permission to have a right to end your life, it is rather like looking for a needle in a haystack. There is no halachic right or even any halachic expectation that ending a life is permissible. It's only permissible in really, really limited circumstances, such as martyrdom, such as looking at just war and the expectation what you can go out and do in war. I guess the most famous one, Haba lahorgecha, hashkem lahorgo. If somebody comes to kill you, you have the right to kill them first, if you are certain that is what they're coming to do. So that's kind of, those are kind of the Jewish framings of it. Talmud, very clear, confirms the primary goal of the law of Torah is to uphold life. And the most famous, I guess, example is the Maccabean times, when the Hellenistic army, as you know, attacked a group of very pious Jews on Shabbat. They didn't fight back; they were all killed. And so the Maccabees, who came after them, ruled that actually to save life, you can break all the rules of Shabbat. I mean, it is the primary goal of Jewish life is to keep living. But what we know as well is that halakha isn't the only place that we go to understand an issue that isn't legal, but actually a moral issue. And when we come to our own decision, really where we need to look Jewishly is what's called hashkafa. It comes from a root meaning to look down or to observe. And the idea of hashkafa, it's very common in the Orthodox world, not so common certainly in the European Jewish world. I don't know, Reform world. I don't know where it is in North America. No, okay. So hashkafa is actually, it's kind of like a perspective. It's the underlying ideals that will emerge from our texts as we read them. Hashkafa is about questions that really are relevant to our how we're living our lives. And the idea of hashkafa is that we create a worldview, we create a cohesive frame that pieces together all the different parts of our lives and sets a sort of direction for ourselves in which we'll be oriented. So difficult decisions, we go to hashkafa, we go to a hashkafic process, I should say, maybe. There's no such thing as a books of hashkafa. It's a process to find nuanced, well-grounded, applicable ways of looking at things that actually benefit more than just one person. So that's my kind of introduction. Am I speaking too fast, by the way? Are you all okay? You're okay? I do know I speak too fast, so do complain bitterly if I do. So what I have is, I sent to Micah yesterday an extraordinarily large document of texts. It's about half the texts I originally had, and he will share them with you. But what I'm going to do is share them now on the screen and kind of give you a whiz through a hashkafic process of looking at different texts, not to reach a clear conclusion, but to give you the kind of the perspective, the hashkafa, the worldview, the looking around. to start to think about what is a decision that you might think is the right decision. Shir is going to send all of these to you. It's about 25 pages, I think, isn't it, of text? So it's a lot of text, but I promise you I had 60 pages to begin with. So let me just find them. Can you see that? Yes? No, you can see that. Great. Okay. So I want to begin really at the very beginning with the classic text that everybody uses.
Sorry, Rabbi, if it's possible for you to make it a little bigger, make it the full screen width, then that's better.
Is that better?
That's great.
Okay. So we're not going to look at each of these texts in detail because we have an hour. But I think it's just important to really kind of be aware of them. They are the kind of classic texts which frame how Jews think about this. So the famous one, the most famous one, choose life, that you and your offspring will live. That's the one from Deuteronomy. Of course, there's a famous one also in Leviticus 18. It's all about keep my laws, obey my things, so you will live. It's threaded through Torah texts. Do this in order to live. Choose life. Famous one also from Job, basically saying, God gives, God takes away. It's part of our normal kind of funeral service as well. Actually, our life is given to us by God. I'm going to have to use my fingers. I don't really see a lot of fingers. The most famous story, I think, that's used a lot for assisted dying when people start to look at it, is the story of the death of Saul. Saul has lost the battle. He knows he's going to be taken captive. He fears what that will do for him. And he says to his arms bearer, draw your sword and kill me so that they don't make sport of me. His arm bearer, he was the king, his arms bearer refuses, and Saul grasps his sword and he falls upon it. So he chooses death. He chooses to take his own life, not exactly medically assisted dying, but here is a very famous case of somebody in Bible choosing death as the least worst option for them. So, but actually, in the second book of Samuel, what we find out is that he didn't actually manage to do it. And he asks a random Amalekite who happens to be around, finish me off. I am in agony. I am barely alive. And the random Amalekite takes pity on him and finishes him off, and then goes to tell David what's happened. That's kind of the most famous story that people use for assisted dying. I'm not going to go through the commentary, but essentially, the commentators say, yeah, but suicide is okay in certain circumstances, and those circumstances are really when you're going to be taken in and terrible things happen to you. It's not something that you do simply because you're frightened or you're in pain or whatever else it is. That's codified in Maimonides. And very clearly codified. And as we go through these texts, you'll see them again and again. When a person kills a healthy person or a sick person who's on the verge of dying, or even somebody even in their actual active dying phase, it's murder. It's murder. There is just no two ways about it. Unless you're doing it like the Amalekite, somebody who was so badly wounded by others that he's clearly going to die. You didn't make it happen. His death is not your fault. If you then put him out of his misery, you are not seen as a murderer. That's the only time. The second kind of category that the rabbis really look at and talk about is, who does a body belong to? Do we have the right to take my life? Do I have the right to do this? And the answer, I'm afraid, is that the body belongs to God. God owns everything. What we have is only because God has loaned it to us, and we have to return it. And I'm not going to take you through these, but here they all are. Well, here are some of them, a good selection of them. And even gets codified yet again by Maimonides. Even when there is a murderer who says, I did murder, I will pay compensation, the answer is that actually he can't pay compensation because that soul belonged to God. It's not anybody. It's not the Go'el. It's not the blood redeemers, the relatives. right to get any compensation. That soul belonged to God. It's an interesting one, maybe looking at post-Holocaust, but still. Another famous one, again, it's God's. It's God decides when things are. Everything is set in your life, a time for everything, including a time for giving birth and a time for dying. But the end of that passage, I think, is really something we don't often see. I realize the only worthwhile thing there is actually to enjoy my life and to do good. That is the purpose of my life. I should enjoy my life. I should do good things, and I leave the rest of it to the Creator. So right across text, we find the same thing. Famous song from the Slichot service, Hanashama lach, the soul is yours, the body is yours, be merciful to us. Repeated again and again through all of Jewish tradition, this idea, the body and the soul belong to God. The third kind of thing to think about is the value of human life. If you look there, it's very clear again in rabbinic tradition, human life is valuable just intrinsically, infinitely, not minutes of it, not hours of it, the whole of it, and every individual minute cannot be divided. The very first declaration of that principle that human life is sacred is Genesis 9:6. So that's even before Judaism, if you like. That's actually the Noahide covenant. But Selem Elohim asa et ha'adam, in the image of God, God made human beings. And so destroying a human being is akin to destroying something of God. And so you shouldn't do it. You don't have the right to do it yourself. The Sanhedrin passage, again, these are very famous passages, often used again. Every human being descends from this one person who is B'Tselem Elohim. So what we come to with all of these texts really is that human life is regarded of such immense inherent value that actually only in the unusual circumstances, which are being forced to do idolatrous behavior, sexual immorality, which is essentially incest, and murdering somebody else, except in those situations, we do anything to affirm life. We can break any law of Torah. So this is why if you ask an Orthodox rabbi, is assisted dying okay in Judaism, they will say to you quite clearly, no, it's not. Look at all these texts. But there are some very interesting things, I think, which is this comes from Yoma, the tractate in the tractate of Talmud discussing Yom Kippur. And now we have something that is kind of interesting and slightly nuanced, makes us think differently, maybe. With regard to a pregnant woman who smells food, she's overcome, you feed her, because anything that fails could lead to something life-threatening. Okay. If a person is ill and he requires food because there's a potential danger to his life, you feed him according to the medical experts. And if there are no experts, then you feed him according to his own instruction and he needs no more. And so there's this sort of idea that actually the saving of life, you go straight to the person whose body is experiencing this pain, and you do something about it. And then some quite extraordinary things, really. With regard to a pregnant woman and she craves pork or whatever it is, you give her it. I mean, you start off with little tiny bits, and then and if that's okay, that's fine. Then you give her a little bit of the gravy, and if that's okay. But if she doesn't want it, you give her everything. You give her everything, because actually she's producing life. She is a living being. If that's what her body tells her she wants, that's what you give her. So we start to have a little bit of, if you like, patient autonomy in this, or at least what the patient says is more than what the medical expert says. Again, in Yoma, there's something marginally different. I really kind of liked this one because In the case of somebody who's seized with life-threatening, always life-threatening, on Yom Kippur, you can feed him on Yom Kippur, you can feed him anything, even impure on Yom Kippur. The bit that I like is, in the case of one whom a mad dog bit, you shouldn't feed him because it doesn't work. So don't, you can only give him things that you think are going to work. But then actually somebody else comes along and says, yeah, it might work. If that's what's going to work, you give him that. So even on Shabbat, even though this is normally prohibited, because there is uncertainty whether it's life-threatening or not, you can't tell, you still override all the rules of Shabbat in order to treat this person, to keep their life going. Slightly different circumstances. There's an avalanche. You don't know if there are people under there. You don't know if they're alive or dead. It's Shabbat. You still go and look. If they're alive, you can do anything to keep them. You can get them out of there and so on. If they're dead, you kind of go, okay, he's dead. It's Shabbat. Shabbat now takes precedence again. So always this kind of thrust of thinking, saving life supersedes everything pretty much. I put in one prayer from the Siddur. I'm sure most of you will know it very well. The reminder, the soul you gave me is pure. You gave it and you will take it away. And my job is, while it's here, is to bless you and so on. The fourth one, we're kind of galloping through, but you will have all these documents to spend hours looking at later, galloping through. The duty to care for your own body. It's taken from this verse in Deuteronomy. Take utmost care, watch yourself scrupulously, do everything so that you don't forget. Make sure you teach your children. How is that verse used? Maimonides uses it. It is a positive mitzvah to remove any obstacle that could pose a danger to life. Be very careful regarding these matters, because Deuteronomy says, beware for yourself and guard your soul. Watch yourself scrupulously, slightly different translation. And then Maimonides takes that further. Maimonides, of course, was a doctor. If a person leaves a dangerous obstacle and doesn't remove it, then he negates the observance of a positive commandment to safeguard the health, and he violates a negative commandment not to cause blood to be spilt. So there is going to, again, preservation of life, preservation of life. This is the absolute thrust of it. 21, with Vayikra Rabbi. Vayikra Rabbi is the oldest Agadic Midrash. It's the oldest sort of storytelling Midrash written around the book of Leviticus, and it's around 5th century, but it has texts which are clearly much earlier than that. And again, I'm really very fond of this one as well, actually. It talks about the man of kindness is good for himself, quoting Proverbs. And the students say to Hillel the elder, where are you going? And he says, I'm going to do a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? To get myself clean, to go and bathe. And they said, is it a mitzvah? And he said, yeah, if you can have statues of things that you keep clean, how much more so a body that's created in the image of God? And then there's a second exposition on it. A man of kindness, good for himself. The disciples say, where are you going? He says, I'm going to perform an act of kindness with the guest inside the house. And they say to him, every day you had a guest? And he says, yeah, the guest inside my body is my soul. One day it's here, one day it's not here. I have to protect it. I have to look after it because it is a guest. It is on loan to me. Moving swiftly through, suffering. And the phrase, I put it in the title because I find it really helpful. I find it really helpful both in my work as a spiritual care lead, but also in terms of looking at these texts with a hashkafic kind of lens. The heart knows the bitterness of the soul. Back to Yoma, Tractate Yoma. There's a lot about this because they're really interested in what you do on Yom Kippur with people who aren't well or who aren't feeling well. And again, it's really interesting. They start off by saying, if somebody's ill and in life-threatening, then if the medical expert says, feed him, you feed him. This is all about Yom Kippur. And then there's a question, what if he says, I really need this? So the doctor says, he doesn't really need this. This isn't that life-threatening. If the man says it feels that life-threatening, the patient says, it feels that life-threatening, you listen to the patient. So we're back again to the idea that there is more to this than kind of the skill of medicine. There is something about the patient's own feelings about things, about how they feel, about what's going on. And what's the reason? quotation from Proverbs, the heart knows the bitterness of the soul, meaning the ill person knows just how bad they feel. And the doctor might say, well, you shouldn't be feeling that bad, the medicine should be working, whatever, whatever it is. No, the person's word is taken. And then it goes on. They talk about, well, the doctor's more of the expert. That's why it's really important that we don't defer to experts. We defer to the person who feels that they are in a life-threatening situation. They need food, or they will faint, they will die, whatever. So it's really important. It is also, it feels a little bit also like eat, my child, because if the doctor says that the ill person needs food, but the ill person says he doesn't need to eat, then you still listen to the doctor. And why is this? Because he might be delusional. He might not really understand that he needs something. So you listen to the expert who says they need this for life, even if the other person says, not sure I do. And you listen to the patient if they say, I need this for life, even if the doctor is not certain or not present. So we're back again in this worldview of we're still in life is supreme. It's the preservation of life is supreme, but we're also in this world of if somebody feels unwell, you listen to what they say they need. And it goes on and on. I'm not going to go too far. I hope I would suggest getting a nice whiskey or a good cup of coffee or whatever it is. It's evening here, and enjoying these texts because they are really very fabulous texts. But it goes on and on. Who needs to eat what? Who says? But it repeats again and again and again. The heart knows the bitterness of its soul. All the experts are ignored in the face of the person's own sensitivities, their own suffering. Now, talking of suffering, the first I've sort of put it into little bits. There is a story of people. There's one story that I can find of people who actually preemptively choose death. This is apart from Saul, obviously. Actually, preemptively choose death because they are going to have much further suffering if they stay alive. And this is a story, it's actually a Baraita, so it's an external text to the tradition. But there is this thing, it's in Tractate Gittin, we're still in Talmud. Somebody wants to come in, I don't know if I can do that right. There was an incident involving 400 boys and girls, and they were taken captive for these are Jewish kids, obviously, for the purposes of prostitution. And they know this is what's going to happen to them. They're on the boat, and they know being human trafficked for slavery and prostitution. And they know what they're going to do. And they say to them, they have a discussion. It's a really interesting story. They have a discussion. Should we just kill ourselves now, or do we have to stay alive in this set of circumstances, or can we kill ourselves? I mean, these stories echo through Jewish history, actually, about at what point you decide what point you decide not to be taken to something worse. Masada is an obvious example. So the oldest child among them has this conversation. God said, I will bring you back from Bashan. I'll bring them back from the depths of the sea. In other words, if we go into the depths of the sea, God will find us still. We won't be completely lost. So they ask themselves, but they have a kind of a rabbinic discussion, and then they decide that they will in fact kill themselves. The girls say, okay, killing myself is not the worst thing to do in Jewish law, rather than being taken for sexual slavery. So the girls all leap into the sea. The boys, it is possibly not a modern text. The boys say, well, if the girls have done it, we don't want to be taken for sexual slaves. How much more so should we not be there because we're men? So they leap into the sea, and the tradition is basically quite approving of them in this story, and it is really a precedent for choosing death to avoid a certain suffering. But again, it's very contained. So the 400 choose to drown rather than being abused. They first have this textual discussion. What happens if we do this? Then it isn't a sort of, I feel bad, I'm going to do this, or I can't face this, or I'm distressed about it. They first ensure they're not going to be committing something so sinful that they will cut themselves off from God, which is extraordinary if you think of them sitting on this boat, but there you go. That's probably why it's a Baraita. So the one that's in a way hardest, I think, for me is that because I always used to think it was a Christian thing and not a Jewish thing, that somehow suffering cleanses you, somehow suffering brings spiritual benefits. And I do occasionally meet people who tell me they were taught in Christian Sunday school that suffering's really good for you, it cleans your soul. And I've always kind of pulled a face and thought, I don't think so. But I'm afraid here it is sitting in our tradition as well. Suffering erases all of a person's sin. It's in brachot. And the idea, I suppose the closest that we now have to it is really Yom Kippur, the idea that we afflict our souls on this day in order to show true repentance, in order to cleanse ourselves. It exists in the Jewish tradition. I've just given you a few of the things, but you can see that while this is a lovely kind of ideal suffering, well, there has to be a reason for suffering. So the reason is God is preparing us for the world to come. You can see that this was a comforting phrase, a kind of solace for people who said, I just don't understand why, the famous book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? There has to be some kind of reason. The universe can't be entirely random. It's sitting there in our tradition, but once you start to get into real life, there's quite a little bit about it. It's Smachot, again, it's a minor tractate of Talmud, but it's talking about a death of suffering, different kinds of deaths. We won't go too far into that. The bit that's really, for me, really, really important is that they know that. They know that that suffering is meant to be the reward, the kind of the cleansing of the soul is meant to be, the reward for suffering is meant to be the cleansing of the soul. It's therefore not a terrible thing. But you have so many stories of the rabbis who had real lived experience of suffering and they really didn't like it. And they were really not going to say, yes, what a good idea. I think this is a great solace to me. So we begin, there's a whole bunch of people. Rabbi Yochanan, a student, Rabbi Shir bar Abba, fell ill, and his teacher came to him and said, is your suffering dear to you? Is it helping you? Is it making you feel cleansed? And Rabbi Shir says, I welcome neither suffering nor its reward. And Yochanan says, okay, get up out of bed. I'm going to help you and be well again, because actually suffering's not a great thing. And then the next story, Rabbi Yochanan then falls ill. Presumably he hasn't caught something from Rav Shir, who knows. Hanina comes to visit him. He says, is it good for you, the suffering? Is it making you feel more cleansed? And he says, I don't welcome the suffering nor its reward. Rabbi Hanina says, let me help you, let me heal you. He restores him to health. And then there's a kind of question, why do they wait? It's clearly a stupid thing. Suffering is not a great thing for people. Nobody wants the suffering nor its reward. And they answer themselves, why did he wait? Well, others have to help him. Others have to come to him and show him a way out of that suffering. It's not something that one can do for oneself. One cannot divest oneself of one's own suffering, one's own pain. You need other people. That's very clear in these stories. Another of Rabbi Yochanan's students falls ill, Rabbi Elazar. Same story, really, pretty much. But they're sort of thinking about, why is he crying? It's all the suffering he endured. And he's actually crying for quite a different reason. He's crying, about whether his life was what he wanted his life to be and so on. But also he's crying, and I think it's really lovely. He says, I'm crying because we're all going to die. We're all going to decompose. We're all mortal. And they both cry. But again, is his suffering dear to you? Neither the suffering nor the reward. Story after story after story after story about the people who say, is suffering a really good thing? Is it really this thing that makes us cleansed? Does it makes us closer to God? In theory, as an ideology, I can continue to say this to people, but in reality, as a human being who feels pain, I'm really not in favor of it, neither the suffering nor the reward. I work in a hospice. Sometimes people tell me that they were told that actually this is good for them because they'll get to heaven quicker, or they'll it's not a Jewish hospice, I hasten to say, they'll get to heaven quicker, or they'll miss the sort of the liminal stage between. Now the rabbis are really clear: suffering is not worth the reward that is purported to be there. The rabbis are, you can probably see from all the visits already, hugely compassionate. And there are many, many stories about how they deal with other people's suffering. They find it very hard. They find it very painful. They always hold the line that they cannot take a life and someone should not take a life. But within that line, they show enormous compassion. So the story in Baba Messiah, Shimon ben Lachish, sorry, that's my dog, Shimon Reish Lachish, famously good-looking, kind of highwayman bandit. He dies, and his best friend Yochanan was just devastated. And they say, who can comfort him? Because what they do know, and they're very clear about all the time, is that comfort is provided by companionship. Comfort is provided by being visited, by somebody paying attention to your pain, by listening to you, by kind of what we would say, walking alongside you. So who will go? And they say, well, these were two very, very clever people. Send one of our, sorry about the, Rev. They will we'll send one of these great students. He's really clever. Maybe he will take the place of Reish Lakish. So he goes, and they're having a debate, and they would debate to and fro, and Rabbi Yochanan says, you're really rubbish. You're no good. You're not like Reish Lakish. When I said something, he would really give me a debate, and then I would really give him another debate, and then we would really understand the halacha. And you're not doing it for me. And I'm just, all you're doing is proving to me that what I've just lost is my best mate, my chevruta partner, and there is no point in my life. And he's so distressed by this. When he realizes that debating the next cleverest person is just such a rubbish experience, he goes insane. He can't bear it any longer. And the rabbis pray and they ask for God to have mercy on him and take his soul. And that's how he dies. So there's huge compassion. They try and send somebody. They try and address his spiritual distress. They realize that they can't. Their response is not to then go, well, would you like us to, take you off this world? But they do pray for God to do something, and God does something. There is huge compassion for suicides. That they begin with a very clear statement: anybody who's committed suicide willfully, they're beyond the pale, they're outside the community, we do nothing. Rabbi Akiva even says, who's the great proponent of visiting, says, leave him and mourn, don't speak of him, don't do a hesped, don't show any of the mourning rituals for him, but we will care about the people who mourn him, because they are in spiritual distress, and we cannot extend that sort of punitive nature to the people who love him. And the general rule, says the Gemara, anything that makes the respect of the living we'll do. Anything that isn't about respect for the living, we don't do. And then they have a whole list of things about stories about how do you know somebody's committed suicide? How do you know they intended to? How do you understand, did they understand what they were doing? And some very little sad stories about little boys whose fathers were punitive towards them and who killed themselves. And they point out that actually, they may have killed themselves, but they didn't really understand the nature of what they were doing. There is a huge sort of literature of people ensuring that suicide can almost never happen in the way that forces you to put that person outside of the community. So even though they hold the rule, they then do everything that they possibly can to make that rule almost impossible to fulfill. So the Aruch HaShulchan, it's a relatively modern book, quite a modern book, but reminds us the guiding principle: where you end your life intentionally, it's attributed to any possible reason: fear, mental suffering, mental incapacity, a mistake, trying to avoid something else, because nobody sane would actually kill themselves, would actually take their own lives, and refers back to that first text we looked at, Saul the righteous who fell on his sword. Anybody who kills themselves, we consider them that they're doing it because they're so afraid of persecution. Think also about those kids in Gittin. So much so that or even in a minor, one who ends their life intentionally, this is considered involuntary. What I should tell you about this is also that he, the writer of Aruch HaShulchan, which is he's called Yechiel Michal Epstein. It's a 18th century book, follows Shulchan Aruch. He was a community rabbi And all of his rulings reference the fact that he understood pastoral care. Everything that he does, he's hugely lenient in all sorts of ways. He understands the need for pastoral care. So he might hold the line, but then he will do anything but anything to provide pastoral care to people in distress. So that's a Rothschild always worth consulting.
Rabbi Rothschild, just as your appointed timekeeper, I'm just pointing out to you the time.
Right. What's the time? Okay. Very fast. The prohibition against hastening death. There is basically a dying man is living in all matters until they die. There is an absolute prohibition. I'm going to let you read all of these about what you cannot do to anybody who is actively dying to hasten their death. Thank you for that, Mike. But you can see all of these texts. You're going to get all of these texts. Whatever happens, anybody who is dying, you can do nothing that will hasten their death. What you can do is remove an obstacle to their death. So if something is stopping them dying, you can remove the obstacle. You can pray for death, as we've seen already. You can remove all kinds of hindrances that you think is making that person kind of hold on, but you cannot actually do it. The most famous story is the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who essentially was in huge pain, was really miserable, was dying very painfully. His students were all praying for him to live. And it was unbearable to his maid, who knew that what was keeping him in the world was the prayers of his students. So she threw a jug down from the roof, a wine jar from the roof, and there was a huge noise. They all sort of stopped in shock. They all stopped praying. In the moment they stopped praying, the obstacle to his death was removed, and he died. It's really clear, and the comment on that in Talmud, in the sin of Gerona, there are times that you can pray for the sick to die when they're suffering greatly, when their condition is terminal. It's absolutely legitimate to pray for death. It is not legitimate to make somebody die. There's lots of other stories about people dying. The famous ones of Hanina ben Tradian, who there's an obstacle removed. I'm going to let you read that. I'm sorry, only an hour. Choni Hamagel, again, famously, sleeps for 70 years, wakes up, everybody he knew is gone. He's alone. His son's already an old man. And he is so distressed, even though people are quoting him, even though he's very respected. He says, he prays for death. He says, I just want mercy. I don't want to be here when there is nobody and nothing for me, no social construct for me. And Yais and Rava says, either friendship or death. So in other words, anybody who feels like they want to be dead, it's because they are completely distressed. They are completely socially unsupported, not given the things that they need. Whizzling through. Rav Chelbo, same thing, but we'll leave all of that. Lots of things about visiting people, about being with people, about praying for their recovery, about praying for their death. There is one really interesting story, which also is part of the hashkafic process, I think, or useful for the hashkafic process. The city of Luz, again, it's in the Talmud, city of Luz. The angel of death couldn't enter the city of Luz, and the people couldn't die. And what did they do? When they got really fed up of life, they walked out of the city walls so that they could die. So in terms of, can I take my own life? Well, they're not actually taking their risk, but they're going back into a situation where the angel of death can bring them. The last thing that I'm going to bring you really is about the idea, and what I said at the beginning is, where in the hashkafic thing do we look at the communal obligation? Let's leave behind the kind of, it's religious not to have your life taken, God owns your life. The communal obligation, the how do I fit into society? What happens when I fit into society? Versus the personal autonomy of the patient who wants to eat or who thinks they need something. The first thing to say is, contrary to lots of people's belief, personal autonomy is not a traditional Jewish value. I know it's the kind of cornerstone of much Reform Judaism, but it is not a traditional Jewish value. And the thing that I wanted us to talk about was really balancing me, what I want, versus we, what is best for the community. Judaism is really clear about people being within a community, having a friendship, doing something that interlocks them with other people. We talk about Am Yisrael, we talk about Kehillah, we talk about community. Phrases like when one Jew is injured, all Jews feel the pain. I've quoted here Jonathan Sachs, who talks about, of course, when we pray in a minyan, we enhance everybody else's prayer. It's not just our own prayer. And the idea that if you separate yourself from the community, the ministering angels come and they say, okay, you've done that. You can't expiate that sin of separating yourself from the community. A quick gallop through. Pirkei Avot, Mishnah, against your will you were formed, against your will you were born, against your will you live, against your will you die, against your will you give an account and a reckoning before God. In other words, your personal autonomy is not part of this discussion. Actually, you have a role. You are on this world to do something. You have a role. And I think I'm going to very quickly, very quickly, I promise you, Micah, and then we'll stop. I wanted to kind of really look at modern things. So David Blech, very famous writer on halachic problems, actually I think puts it really well. He talks about Western society has adopted the notion that actually human dignity is more important than life itself. They have ranked human dignity higher than the value of life. That life without what people without what people feel is their dignity is absolutely not worth living. It's not something that is a traditional Jewish text, but actually it's a real problem in a sense that what we have in the Western world is the preference for an individual need to a societal need. It's not how the Jewish world has operated until really it's hit the modern world. Jonathan Sachs again looks at the difference between Gemeinschaft to going to Gesellschaft, so the idea of community giving way to the individual in a society. And what you do with this. I'm really sorry, I've given you far too many texts, but there you go. I'm sorry, Micah. I'll belt my way through it. The last one that I have for you is the reminder again, Shulchan Aruch codes. Actually, serving the community is the equivalent of being in a minyan. It's the biggest mitzvah that you can do. You don't have to drop serving in the community, the work that you're doing, in order to pray. Your prayer can wait. Serving the community takes preference to a person's prayer. So those are kind of the sources. I hope you have fun with them later on. But the questions that I have for you really are, how do we make our decisions? Where do we balance me versus we? Where do we balance the individual versus society? The texts are really clear. The rabbis hold on to the we while being hugely compassionate and finding as many ways as possible to support the me. But they absolutely hold the society as paramount. I can see you've raised a hand. We'll come there very quickly. I promise you. Jewish tradition holds the community as the scaffolding that holds everything together, not the personal desire of the individual. But Hashkafa talks about.
Where I was tied to a big metal.
Okay. Hashkafa actually also talks about community, but it also tries to understand who is the person within the community. How is an individual's needs met? I'm going to I think stop here and talk about some questions, although this is possibly the most interesting bit. So if you'd like to, I think Aviva was your first question, wasn't it?
And after
I come from a background of a registered nurse with an honors in thanatology, and I guess my question is, if someone's suffering and to the point of wanting to end their suffering, where shouldn't that be considered and be, because if they're suffering so much that they want to end their life, and suffering with ALS or cancer or something, then and even I've had doctors write NPO orders, nothing by mouth, so no food, no water. So aren't we, because if we're not giving them food or water, aren't we hastening
Are they
their
actually dying? I mean, I suppose the question I would ask you is, are they actually dying or are they in pain? Because those are actually two separate issues.
They're in pain. They're on the verge of passing.
I think, I mean, Canada, you're in Canada, I see. I mean, Canada is a really
Yes.
interesting situation because about, I don't know, I think for the 20% of deaths now are medical assistance in dying. Huge numbers of deaths in Canada that's done number that. But clearly society has decided that, or lots of people in society have decided that that's the way to go if you're a Canadian. I think I come from a different place, which is because I come from both Europe but also hospice care. I see people on a daily basis who come in from hospital or from home, suffering in pain, very, very distressed, distraught, family very distraught, good palliative care, good doctors with good cocktails of useful drugs. And I would say at least 90% of those people within a day settle and say, well, I wanted to die, but I don't actually now. So I think it depends. One of the issues with assisted dying, actually, for the future, for society, is it going to stop people investing in palliative care? Because what we know is actually that in the places where there used to be good palliative care and medical assistance in dying has been introduced, the level of palliative care, they go down the table, so to speak, of the level of their palliative care. And then the next question is, if I could have had palliative care, but I chose to have something else, because that's my autonomy, that's fine. What have I done to the people who are not going to get good palliative care because actually the money's not there? This is really not an easy, it's not an easy thing. Seeing suffering is painful. What you see, neither the suffering nor its reward. Seeing the suffering is horrible, is horrific. Nobody thinks it's a good idea. The question that we have to ask ourselves, and I'm not coming up with an answer, Aviva. I'm not sort of saying one is right, one is wrong. What I'm saying is that halakhically they will always look at life, and they will always look at how you end suffering in life, but they will not go that extra step. The question is, in a modern Jewish world where we have both fantastic drugs, but also we have people living much longer and with much more pain and difficulties, and everybody else dies, and the last person that's left in their friendship group or their family or whatever it is, they're lonely, they're spiritually lonely. What do you do? There is no easy answer. That's why I'm really delighted you're going to have a conversation with Rabbi Emily. There isn't a one size fits all answer. But the questions that we have to ask ourselves, I think, are what happens for the needs of the individual, the benefit of the individual, what happens for the benefit of society, and how do we rank that? How do we rank that? I don't have an answer to that. We've got Sabrina and somebody else.
And I see Rabbi Ellen was first, and then Sabrina.
All right, sorry, beg your pardon.
That's okay. Hello again. We met up in Italy.
Oh, right. Yes, of
course. So I guess with, disclosing that I have the utmost respect for our rabbinic forebears, but they had no idea that we could prolong someone's life now who is essentially brain dead. We can keep someone alive without having any kind of life in them through machines. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us as modern rabbis, thank you very much, Rabbi Rothschild, to really ponder this, not just with our rabbinic texts, but with the inclusion now of people like Aviva, and actually my husband's working in this field as well, with people who understand what does life mean in 2026 when someone can be kept alive artificially, or we know that that's going to be the next step and they choose not to be kept alive artificially. So yes, and I agree with you, Rabbi Streifer, that the maid had more, the handmaid to the Rabbi had more foresight as to what was inevitable and what needed to happen by dropping the clay pot off the roof and by allowing those students to let go to let go of having the divine through prayer intervening in keeping that person alive. So that's just my 2 cents.
I mean, I think that's great. I would say to you, things like life support machines are something very different, because in a sense, they are an obstacle to death rather than, you're not actually, if somebody's already dead, they are an obstacle. I know halakhically there's a huge debate, but actually, and I think when you're thinking about assisted dying, you tend to be thinking more about people who are fearful of pain, who have a terminal diagnosis, but they're not at the stage of being kept artificially alive, if you like. So that, or at least, and I think, the rabbis had no idea also about the kinds of cocktails of drugs that people can give. I mean, palliative care can give extraordinary. When I first started working there, my eyes were out on stalks with the kind of stuff that they kind of routinely were able to dispense, which you're not allowed to dispense anywhere else in the UK. But I think there is a real question about, once you have somebody who's on a life support machine and their brainstem dead or brain dead or whatever, or once somebody has literally no meaning at all in their life, that's a really hard one. The hardest bit of that, I think, is probably with dementia patients, because people who have dementia, it's a fear, I think, of all of us, that we will end up with dementia. People who have dementia cannot give informed consent to have medical aid in time. The people who might, in the sense, most feel that, because they're not even aware of it. So the question is it our distressing people with dementia? Is it their distress? Are we allowed to take their consent away from them? Where does their autonomy sit there? What does society do with people with those conditions which we know are not recoverable from? This is a really not easy subject, especially not in an hour. That's why, in a way, I gave you so many texts, because I really wanted you to see the struggles that the rabbinic tradition has with this. They're not hard-hearted at all. They're struggling as we struggle.
So we'll go to Sabrina.
I'm not quite sure who's where. I'm going to rely on you, Micah, to...
So we have Sabrina, and then I think we're out of time. Go ahead, Sabrina.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Rabbi, my question in the chat is it permissible to refrain from eating and drinking when you are close to death in order to allow yourself to die? For example, when you've been already diagnosed as terminally ill. In my family's case, my sister was in bed and had lost all her muscle strength. She couldn't even get out of bed at that point. My grandmother was required to have transfusions and dialysis, and she decided to discontinue that and stop eating and drinking. Do we have any guidance about situations like that? Is it permissible to stop eating and drinking?
I think then it depends on where you're going to sit that. Is that sitting on causing death, or is that sitting on removing an obstacle to a natural process that's already happening? And you have to make those, I'm not here to give you sucked in here. You have to make the decision, where does it sit in that? I mean, certainly in the UK, it's legal and permissible. And in my hospice, people come in who refuse to eat or drink. And we have guidance from the government that says, well, you keep them as comfortable as you can, you look after them, you look after their families, and you do not give them anything to eat or drink. That's UK law, that's not Jewish law. But it seems to me that the lens you choose to look at is this really something that is going to unnaturally cause the death, or is this something that is simply allowing a natural process to take place if I remove it? So one of the things we didn't look at, with the obstacles, they talk about if there's a lot of noise outside and you put straw down in the street so it's not so noisy, you remove the sort of distraction so the person can let go. Putting in frames of is it permissible is really hard. I mean, halakhically there is one, very hard kind of thing about, but actually that's why hashkafa is so useful, I think. There are stories about patients who refuse to eat and to drink. And then the question is, the heart knows its own bitterness. That phrase is really important. That person has the autonomy to know just how bad it is. And I think that's a really important part. For me, what's difficult really is when it's about, I don't feel dignified, because actually we might think I wouldn't feel great in a wheelchair, but when we're in a wheelchair, we discover actually it's lots of stuff is possible. So it's really hard. Everybody is an individual in this. So given that, I think one of the questions in terms of legislation is what's best for society versus what's best for the individual. And that's something that the lawmakers struggle with.
So I think, unfortunately, we have to come to an end. I want to thank Rabbi Rothschild for this whirlwind tour of these fascinating and such important texts and for leading us in this discussion. There's clearly much more to be said. And so I want to invite those of you who are available on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to join with Rabbi Emily Lozman Ostrov for a follow-up discussion about this topic as we follow up and continue talking about what Rabbi Rothschild has taught us about today. Thank you as well to all of our partners for making this program possible and to all of you for being here. And once again, a huge thank you to Rabbi Sylvia Rothschild. Looking forward to seeing all of you at the last session of this series, which is on Monday, June 8th, on protecting LGBTQ plus rights in a Jewish view. Thanks, everyone, and have a great week.
And yeah, can I say thank you? And please do. I know it's a bit daunting, but Micah's going to send you the sources. Read them with a hashkafic mind rather than a is it permissible mind, and see what you make of it.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.